but I first started reading Vanessa's work in 2017 when Mirror Sydney was published. And I've been hooked ever since. I felt an immediate kinship with Vanessa's way of being in and seeing the world as she describes it and shares it in her writing and drawings. And there's a particular generosity, I think, to be found in this way of being, which comes from a close attention to the world. And reading Vanessa's books, I regularly experience that feeling of intimacy, which comes from the best books, where you feel like an author is taking you along and saying, here, look at this, and allowing you to kind of look closely at something in their company. So Vanessa does that in all of her written work. She also does it, I highly recommend her podcast, Mirror Sydney, which I started listening to last year during one of the lockdowns. So there's lots of different ways in which I suppose Vanessa explores this attention to the world and engages in it. So last year, first half of last year, when I heard that a new book was on its way, I was excited, and that excitement and anticipation has been abundantly rewarded with Gentle and Fierce. So thank you, Vanessa. Thank you for your work and for being here this evening to share it with us. Oh, you're still muted.
Okay. Here I am unmuted. A box came up and said the host will not allow you to unmute.
Oh, host, how could you?
I haven't quite forgotten Zoom to that extent, although it's been a very quiet summer in Zoom land for me. So, well, thank you, Anna, for your generous introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you and with everyone this evening to talk a little bit about Gentle and Fierce. Been really looking forward to chatting with you tonight. So as you mentioned, I am here on Gadigal land where I live and work, and I pay my respects to all elders. I also would like to say Happy Lunar New Year.
Ah, yes, the water tiger. Yeah, I hear it's a year of extremes. I'm hoping that means good extremes. My heart sank a little bit when I heard that, but I think it's supposed to be auspicious as well. Yeah, so fingers crossed. Yeah. So before, you're going to do a reading early on, but before we kind of launch into that, I thought I'd start with something that's become a bit of a regular segment in the paperback Salon series. So Gentle and Fierce, I think you've described it as a memoir in essays, and each of those essays is inspired or comes out in some way of an encounter with an animal, whether it's real or imagined or represented in some other way. But it also reads to me as an encounter with other writers. There's so many wonderful. There's a wonderful essay in which you visit Sylvia Plath's grave, and another one where you kind of look for traces of Walter Benjamin's childhood in Berlin, following his description of his childhood. And I had a wonderful kind of few months after first reading Gentle and Fierce, in which I followed one of the other kind of threads that you have woven into Gentle and Fierce, and that's Georges Perec. There's a great essay called Perec's Cat. So I went on after reading Gentle and Fierce to read a lot of Perec's nonfiction. I'd read Life, a User's Manual years ago, but it was lovely to discover his other work. So basically, to begin with, I want to mine you for other recommendations. So I wonder, what are you reading at the moment?
Well, I did a lot of reading over the summer, which was very pleasurable. Usually over summer, I'll read a classic. So I'll choose a particular classic, either one I haven't read or one that I want to reread. And I read Villette by Charlotte Bronte
Mm.
this summer, which um, is it was her last novel. So it was published 2 years before she died, and perhaps one that people might not so readily have read, but the protagonist, whose name is Lucy Snow, highly based on Charlotte's own experience teaching so she was a teacher in a school in Belgium in her younger years, and this novel is based on that experience. But Lucy Snow, the protagonist, is one of my favorite characters of English literature of that period. And I think if we met Lucy Snow, she'd be one of those people who's very inscrutable. You can't quite tell what Lucy Snow is thinking. But in the novel, which charts her experience teaching, and it's a love story, it's a bit of a ghost story, we get that access into her inner world, and she's an incredibly observant person of her own character and of everything around her. So there's a lot of pleasure to be had, especially for me. I perhaps feel some kind of connection to Lucy Snow as somebody who is very much an observer, often a quiet observer. I don't know about the inscrutability. I think she's more inscrutable than me. So it was a great pleasure to read Villette over the summer. I read quite a lot, but perhaps I'll just choose a few. I read a lot of fiction, so I write non-fiction, primarily autobiography or essays, but a lot of my reading is fiction. And I mean, maybe that's something we can talk about later, that fiction, non-fiction relationship. But I read 2 novels by Japanese authors that were originally published in Japanese in the mid-1990s, which I think is perhaps a coincidence, but, because they're quite different novels. The first one's an I novel by Minai Mizumura. And this one is, so I novel is a genre in Japanese literature, Japanese fiction, which is perhaps what we'd call an autofiction or autobiographical fiction. So it's a novel in which the character and the events are very close to the authors. And this one is, my interest in it, I mean, there's many interesting things about it, but my particular interest in it is that it's set over one day. And I'm a big fan of novels set in a day. I love a novel set in a day. So I was interested in that aspect of it. And when I read it, I found it just to be quite fascinating for that reason, but also because it's, so the author and the protagonist were born in Japan, moved to America, grew up in America. So there's a lot of very interesting reflection about growing up and living between 2 cultures, thinking about race and identity. And there's also there's all these conversations she has with her sister over the phone, and then conversations that she's had with her sister in the past. So it's also about the sisterly relationship as well. So it started off with my interest in novel in a day, but then it branched off into all these other fascinating directions. So that was the first of the 2 novels by Japanese authors that I read. The second one is a dystopian novel, so quite different. It's called The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. And this touches on another area that I'm interested in reading into, which is fiction and non-fiction that has some kind of relationship to objects and is considering human relationships to objects. So in this novel, it's set on an unnamed island where the people who live there some mornings will wake up and an object has disappeared. So it can be something like roses or birds or calendars. There's all sorts of things. I mean, part of the enjoyment of the novel and also the chilling elements of the novel is finding out what things are going to disappear. And there's this real sense of foreboding as you read it. So I won't give away too many, but so whatever the thing is disappears, but also people's memories of the thing disappears. And there's like a gap in their memory and they can't remember these things. But some people are still, by some quirk of their memory, able to remember remember the lost or the disappeared things, and the memory police track them down, and they disappear. So that's on the premise of the novel, and I mean, dystopian scenario, quite chilling, but very attentive to details and very attentive to the object world. And I very much enjoyed it for that. So I could keep going for for longer, but I think that's probably enough for now. And I'll probably mention other books along the way, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's so captures too that I haven't yet read The Memory Police or an I novel, but Robert read an I novel and he really loved it, and I've heard other good things from customers at the shop. But that sense in The Memory Police, the way that you describe it, conveys some of the power of objects too, that they're not dead, they're kind of alive with meaning, as well as, and one of those meanings is the memories that we attach to them, and so on, I suppose. But that's something that really comes through, I think, in Gentle and Fierce, is how much life there is even in an apparently inanimate object, say, you know, a ceramic otter, or, you know, so that these actually have real power, and that power persists after we are gone, or after our relationship with them has passed as well.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm sitting in a room surrounded by secondhand objects that have had a life before me, and that's one of the things I love about secondhand things, is that sense that they have had a life before. Maybe not in quite in that literal sense where I'm thinking, oh, who owned this and what did they do with it? Sometimes I think that, sometimes not. But I think it's a good reminder of the, you know, immense life and vitality of everything around us. And as a writer, I mean, I find that energizing, that everything that surrounds me is a portal into other things, other stories, other worlds, potentially. And one of the things that writers are able to do is follow some of those portals, or through close attention to maybe particular objects, as happens in Gentle and Fierce and in my other writing, it's a way into thinking about wider stories. So Gentle and Fierce, for those who don't know, it's focused on animals and human relationships with animals and animal representations. So not meaning to suggest that animals are things, which sounds a bit crude, but thinking about how, say, I mean, growing up in a suburban or urban environment and living in an urban environment, I wanted to consider that idea that I wasn't disconnected from what we might call nature. It was all around me, and something like a figurine is not some inert object. It, you know, whatever. So the figurine of the otter, for example, it leads me out into, if I want it to, it can lead me out into the world to think about these animals and what this particular representation means, or how it's been shaped. And so thinking about connecting even a very urban kind of life with a sense of environmental consciousness or environmental thinking.
And you make that wonderful point that, you know, often the animals that are, say, very readily available as a representation, so either in a figurine or an image, or are often those that are most endangered, I suppose, most at threat from extinction, and whose numbers are declining in the natural world as well. There's a kind of correlation between those.
Yes, there's many more polar bears in representation than there are, just to give one example. Yeah, I mean, that was one of the ideas that started off the book, and my desire to write the book was this observation that I live surrounded by animals, and of all different kinds, but how many are the real animal? And thinking about children growing up, when I was growing up as a child, and children growing up now, like our children's worlds are full of animals of all different kinds. And not to be too maudlin, but thinking about the state of environment, the earth, climate change and thinking, you grow up surrounded by this plenitude of, say, animals in books and things like that, but we would like to keep them, in the world as well as in books.
Yeah, there's I want to I got sidetracked because you talk about so many interesting things, but I wanted to mention, it kind of draws back with this to this idea of representation and our place within the wider world, I suppose. And I'm actually reading at the moment Jennifer Higgie's The Mirror and the Palette. I don't know if you've read it. It's about women's self-portraits over the last 500 years. But there was a wonderful nugget that one of those lovely meaty bits of information that I read the other day, which I wanted to share with you. Maybe you already know, but it seemed especially kind of pertinent to talking about your work. And that is that before he invented the printing press, Gutenberg had a mirror making business. And that kind of coming together of mirrors and reading and writing and representation, all of which are ways of looking, and each of which is either distorted or extended depending on your point of view, seems like such an interesting way of kind of connecting these things. And in Mirror Sydney, you talk about this idea of, I think in the very beginning, the threshold between the image or the thing or the kind of lived experience and its shadow or its mirror image. And there's this kind of connection between these two. And I wonder if that got me thinking about mirrors and memoirs, and I wondered if this kind of threshold space between the real, as we like to call it, and the kind of represented world was something that you were thinking about over the course of composing Gentle and Fierce.
It's interesting to think of the word reflection and that as something which spans my work, because I think it does. So there's a reflection as a figure, so like an image, which is a version. So you see your own reflection in a mirror and it's a version of you. It sort of both is and isn't you, which is a bit like autobiography, which is both, it both is and isn't the author. And every reader is going to have a different version of the author anyway, as they bring the text to life in their mind. So yeah, there's that idea of the reflection as a version, but it's also a process. So we talk about reflecting on things, and my writing is very reflective, and the process of reflection is a big part of my writing process. So yeah, that's that idea of deeper thinking, or part of reflection that's in the word, to mean bend back or to turn around, that part of it. So like scrutinizing self and world and that dynamic between them. And yeah, so that, and also reflection is, it's quite a gentle, it can be quite a gentle way of thinking. And that, yeah, certainly in aligned with Gentle and Fierce, which so it started with gentleness, and then as I developed that idea, I brought ferocity in there to to work together. I wouldn't say, like, I didn't mean to have them as oppositional. I meant to have the thought of them together in more of a dialectic relationship, perhaps.
Well, I want to ask you about gentleness and ferocity, but maybe before I do that, how do you feel about doing a reading?
I feel good about doing a reading. I'll just get the book from down here. It's very hot here today, so apologies.
We've just had a blessed cool change. It's such relief. It's been horrendous here. Yeah.
have a giant glass of iced tea, which I'm swigging. Apologies. I normally wouldn't appear so thirsty. Okay, so I'm going to read from a story called Glass Fish. It's the shortest one in Gentle and Fierce. I'll read the first half of it and read the second half at the end of our conversation, perhaps. And one thing about this one, it, which I mean, you wouldn't be able to tell this by reading it, and I don't think I've really shared it elsewhere, but when I wrote it, I had this structure in mind, which was of a breath. So a full, like, breathing in and then like an exhalation. So, and then an inhalation. So the paragraphs go from like 7 lines, 6 lines, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that's how I wrote it. And so I'll read the exhalation first. Actually, in the end, it didn't end up being that neat. Like, it might be 7, 7, 6, 5, 5, but that was the movement that I wanted in the story. And oh, sorry, really long preamble. This is a story that is about this room that I'm sitting in, but the desk that I'm talking about is not the desk I'm sitting at now. I'll just turn the computer around. It's that desk over there where I do all my writing. This is where I do all my Zooming.
It's good to keep them separate. Yeah.
Well, on my writing desk, I feel very superstitious about my writing desk. Okay, Glass Fish. In my room, sitting at my desk, I feel as secret as a yolk. My shell is the 4 walls, painted in a shade called Phantom Dream, although it is a bland off-white that provokes no such fantasy. The walls have postcards and pictures stuck to them, and blank patches are marked with blue tack stains where cards have been taken down and not replaced by new ones. Chips in the paint reveal glimpses of a previous layer, a pale pink memory. The room can take me elsewhere as much as contain me. The carpet, patterned with purple ripples, seems to move like the shallows of a river, taking me along with its tide. The window is an eye out to an oak tree with leaves that tremble even on breezeless days. High up on the wall, through the lattice of the air vent, the room breathes. Suspended at the end of a cord in the center of the ceiling is a pink glass light shade that collects the husks of the insects which are drawn into its glow. The room is at the back of the house, in the corner of the lot, at the end of the road before it reaches the railway line. The room is a center around which other things move. Freight trains run all day and night. Planes ascend from the airport in the east, angling up and away. Closer are the ibis, soaring over with their white wings outstretched. In the evening, flying foxes cross the sky in a steady procession of black shapes, like pieces of dislodged light. The room has its own menagerie, a polystyrene bear 1 metre tall and painted glitter silver, a ceramic crocodile small as a fingernail, a long blue-black raven tail feather, a ball of soft grey fur from a pet rabbit, a collection of cicada shells, a woodblock print of a cat sitting on a windowsill, a glass fish with a swirl of colour in its belly. The fish travelled here in the centre of a suitcase, cushioned by winter clothes, floating within layers of bubble wrap. When the tape that secured it was unpeeled, the touch of the antique dealer who had wrapped it fluttered around the room like a moth, farewelling the fish into a new sea. The room is for dreaming in and writing in and other secondary purposes which cluster like minnows. It is for this reason I acquired the glass fish. It moves through the school of small concerns, a charm of serene focus. The room is cluttered, but there is always space for more things. Moving books and ornaments aside, I place the fish at the centre of the shelf. Here, the fish carries my reflection.
It's lovely to end with the reflection too, or to
Yes.
pause with the reflection.
Very serendipity.
Yeah, I know. There's so much I love about this essay in the book, because I feel like it's a kind of phantom dream of its own too, like it's a world or many worlds dreamed from within this sheltered kind of oak-like, a yolk-like kind of space. And there's a gentleness too, I suppose. I love that idea of having something to focus on when all that other school of kind of concerns is kind of around you. Around you. But also that, I don't know if you would call it ferocity, but that sense of firmness of guarding this kind of space quite, we all need a space like this, right? Like if we're fortunate enough. And I suppose this maybe is a good time to ask you about the title, because after I heard about the book, I heard that, a new Vanessa Berry is coming. It's called Gentle and Fierce. I'm like, I wonder, what can it be about? Because gentleness, especially, I think, is something at the moment, especially, is quite undervalued, even dismissed as something associated with weakness or passivity. Whereas, in fact, I think what you show over the course of this book is the power of gentleness, and the power of gentleness working in tandem or alongside or drifting in and out of kind of ferocity or other kinds of ways of being in the world. And so I guess it's a long preamble to asking, what does it mean to you, gentle and fierce?
Well, I think of them, I mean, they're qualities, and as I mentioned before, I was interested in gentleness as a quality anyway. And then I also had the idea to write the book that was themed around animals, so a memoir themed around animals in some way. And I didn't immediately connect the two, but then as I was writing, started to write the essays and focusing on particular animals, I thought about the kinds of qualities that are ascribed to humans and non-human animals, and gentleness and ferocity often are. So, the gentle puppy, the fierce tiger, and they're also very much used for humans as well. And so they're qualities, but I also thought about them as life forces. So they sustain life. So we need gentleness in order to sustain our life, but sometimes we need ferocity as well. And so when I was reading about gentleness, I found this book by Anne Dufour-Montel, who provides the epigraph for the book, for Gentle and Fierce, and it's called The Power of Gentleness. And it was such a perfect articulation of a lot of the ways that I hadn't realized that I felt about gentleness, that it or can be a strength. It's something that's transformative. It's something that's fundamental to life. And it's quite a short book, and it's a collection of vignettes that kind of gently approach gentleness, and that it comes at the topic from lots of different angles. But it also has this, like, stylistically, it has this beautiful repetition, and gentleness is, and then it will give a different kind of definition or idea about it all throughout it. So that was very formative for me, and it kind of emboldening. There wasn't a lot written about gentleness when I looked what had been written about it. So Anne Dufour-Montel was a philosopher and a psychoanalyst who also wrote about risk. Actually, The Power of Gentleness' subtitle is Meditations on the Risk of Living. So she's not saying gentleness is something that's weak and passive and easily dismissible. She's saying that it's absolutely vital to our lives, and that in situations of risk also comes vulnerability, and gentleness is an approach which is perhaps sometimes more powerful than a more kind of active or direct approach. So all these thoughts were swirling around this idea of gentleness, it being this kind of life force. And in the introduction to Gentle and Fierce, I described them in terms of voices. So the gentleness was this persistent whisper, that's how I imagined it, and ferocity was a voice that calls out. And the thought that you you need that range, like you need that range of tone. Like there's the kind of quieter persistence, and then there's sometimes those sort of eruptions and these louder moments. So that also thinking about memory too, and there's the kind of quiet, slow memories that slowly reveal themselves, and then there's these sharp moments in memory as well.
And the thing that I wasn't familiar with Andrew Fomentel's work until I read Gentle and Fierce. But the thing I love about the epigraphs that you use as well is that she describes gentleness as a relationship, and also that it somehow reconciles the past with the future. So it's about time too. And in the opening essay of Gentle and Fierce, called The Compound Eye, I think, you use a phrase, this eye is the eye that sees through time. And I kept kind of marked it when I was starting reading, and then I kept coming back to it. And throughout the book, I started to read that phrase, the eye that sees through time, in two different ways. That the eye, your eye, a way of noticing the world and paying kind of careful attention, is a way of seeing through the kind of lie of clock time, which is utterly, completely invented, I suppose. But it's also an eye that allows a kind of collapsing of different times, past, present, future, and a kind of stretching out of time. Certainly that was my experience of reading the book. I felt there are these wonderful moments in which past, present, future overlay each other so closely that it's as if everything is happening all at once. And that, in the Du Formentel epigraph, with her conception of gentleness in relation to time, it's in that moment of reconciliation between past and future that life kind of, as you say, comes forth and is allowed to exist. And there's so many wonderful moments. And I think when you read the second part of Glass Fish, we'll hear one of those moments in which time does this in your work. But there's another one that I wanted to kind of talk about, which from another essay that I loved, where you travel to the Isle of Man to see the wallabies that are now living there quite happily, it seems. And there's a man who's guiding you, whose name is Dog, and he's walking you through this landscape, and he has the gift of the long view. Like he can see what the landscape has been like, what it is like now, and what's going to happen, not just from a day-to-day kind of point of view, but across centuries. And I think you have this gift too. And I just want to read, I know I'm not supposed to be reading, but I just want to read this one paragraph because I think it's a wonderful example, and I'm hoping that it will lead into something else I want to ask you about. So you're walking through this landscape, Dog's leading you. Time slides forward as I look over at the ash tree, imagining its thirsty roots season after season. This cycle of change will outlive us, but I see, as if through a telescope, a vision in which the three of us walk through the future forest. And Dog says, remember the first time we came here 100 years ago? And I just think that's such a wonderful example, both of the kind of ecological aspect of your kind of way of thinking, but also of the way that memory and imagination and past, present, and future bring forth these, like call forth these kind of ecstatic moments almost. And I wondered if you could talk a bit perhaps about how memory and imagination work together in your work and your experience, I suppose, of them in the process of writing Gentle and Fierce.
Oh, thanks, Anna. It was nice to hear you read. I don't often hear
It's a
people
very lovely book to
poetry.
read, I can't tell you.
So, I mean, I guess the memory is, underlies all the writing that I do in some way, but I like to think of it as a dynamic and maybe a playful force. Like as we know, memory is quite malleable, and I do like to play with it and see what it can do. But I would describe, memory and imagination are just kind of the twin engines of my writing, or the dynamic, that there's a dynamic that exists between them. And I'd like to think that, so I'm a non-fiction writer, but I would like to think that I write a form of non-fiction that's open to imagination, dreams, fantasy, reveries, surreal moments, things that are possible. So like that moment you just read from the essay about the Isle of Man, like, I can shoot us forward 100 years in time very readily, and kind of perform this moment of imagination, which can, and I mean, I guess it's a moment to destabilize that force of the present that's in that particular essay, which is very, I mean, a lot of the essays move around in time a lot, so they'll go from past to present to kind of near past. Anyway, they mix it up quite a lot, but then other ones are more focused on an experience, and that is one of those. But I mean, one of the things that fascinates me about memory and observing the workings of it is that, in any day of our life, we're in many different times at once, and that can be our own personal memories, but also kind of thinking about memory more broadly in a wider sense. We're surrounded by all sorts of what we could describe as memories, through objects, through places. So so being playful with it, and imagination is a form of that playfulness. And I mean, it seems to me something that I can offer as a writer. So as you mentioned right at the start, I do have this very keen attention to particularly the immediate present, and the things around me and their potential to take me or us elsewhere, but also I do have a skill in bringing in the imagination into these kinds of experiences, or being imaginative in setting memories side by side.
There's the final essay in the collection, which, I mean, I love them all. I keep saying, oh, this other essay that I love, but which is called Junk Bug, which, is another wonderful kind of extrapolation, I suppose, from seeing an insect and being curious about that insect, to a nocturnal dream world, to a kind of waking dream world that also harnesses personal memory and the kinds of objects and other kinds of material, physical material that's associated with that kind of work as well. Yeah.
Well, it was my version of Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, of course.
You do in an earlier essay mention Gregor Samsa. I'm like, aha.
Well, yes, I mean,
love it.
Who doesn't love that story? Yeah. I read it most years. I really love it. And Kafka wrote so beautifully and sensitively about animals as well. So it was my version of the Metamorphosis. And so yes, this bug, this little insect, the junk bug, they're this strange shape, and they look like a piece of grit or dust. Then when you get close to it, it is it's made of all this. It puts all these bits on its back, and I somebody who lives with a lot of objects around me, as you can probably see from what's behind me, and I do have a strong relationship with clutter. So I guess at some point I thought, well, I'm a bit like a junk bug, and what if I could think about this this insect in a way that might reflect on that kind of idea of like memory being kind of debris, or carrying things with you physically, or carrying memories and experiences with you. It was a lot of fun to write.
So it's a lot of fun to read. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, some of the essays I found, yes, some were a lot of fun to write. Other ones were kind of delving deeper within, and but yeah, it was. I conceived of the book as a complete collection. Maybe that's something that's interesting. Often essay collections are compilations of essays that have been written and published elsewhere, but I wanted to write a book that was like, one of the ways I describe it is a discontinuous memoir, and I like that. I like that description. I mean, if you read it attentively, you could perhaps construct a timeline of my life, if you so wanted. But it's more of a swirl of experience and existence, and filtered through these ideas of animals. I mean, my idea was not to write a book so much about me, but I mean, I often say to my students when I talk about autobiography that there's different ways of looking. So you can look out, you can use your perspective to look out into the world, or you can use it to look within. And there's different kinds of autobiography. Will do one or the other, but often it does both to different degrees. And so and particularly for me, the kind of autobiography I love to write is the kind that's able to, through my experience, like look outwards, or even if not at a particular thing, like give the reader a sense of a particular way of being in the world. Because yeah, I mean, autobiography is often so much about a particular author's way of being in the world, and whether or not that's directly what the author's intending in the piece, or if it's something that's more indirect through the style or through the theme. I think I'll stop there because I'm getting very excited about autobiography.
There's one of the things that I really love, like, about your style, I suppose, is this kind of fluid sense of drift that and the discontinuous organization of the essays in Gentle and Fierce really helps that. I think the drift between times, it's kind of up to us as a reader to put the pieces of the puzzle together, and as a reader, I like to be trusted to be able to do that. It's not to be told everything, but the drift kind of works to not just across time, but across genres, we've talked a bit about the kind of dream or reverie kind of aspects, but that drift across fiction and non-fiction, and the kind of threshold between those, perhaps, as well as between memory and imagination. Now, I've had the immense pleasure of reading the essay that you've written for the pamphlet that will be published alongside this event, which will be available in the coming weeks. And in it, you give a list of it's a kind of Perec style list or inventory of the things, some of them apparent, some not apparent, that have gone into the writing of Gentle and Fierce. It's a wonderful list. I mean, I love lists, and this is an especially good list. So I won't ruin it for everyone by telling you what's in there. But one of the things that is there, and which I circled the first time I read it, and then I went away and I did some other things, and then I came back to it, and I haven't been able to let this phrase go, and that is memory beyond mind. And I wonder if you can tell us what memory beyond mind means.
It's a term that was coined by a philosopher, Edward S. Casey is a phenomenological philosopher, and I read a lot of his work when I was writing Mirror Sydney, because he writes about a lot about place, and many of his books are about place. He had, and he also writes about memory. I think this is from his book called Remembering, and memory beyond mind is this term which he talks about three kinds. There's body memory, there's place memory, and there's commemoration, which means ritual or event. And he mostly focuses on place memory. And I guess I've sort of extrapolated from that my own idea of that and what it means to me, which is that sense of the memory that's held in the things and places around us. I mean, it's not only an idea that's present in Western philosophical thought, of course. I found that those three words very, very useful for me, just as a good way to express the kind of work that I do. So when I say, oh, I work with memory, I think probably the assumption is it's going to be, I guess, kind of straight memoir, and sometimes it is, but I think, I haven't mentioned zine making yet, and I probably don't have much more time, but I think I will at this point, because a lot of the freedoms and permissions that I felt as a writer have come through zine making. So yes, I'm writing nonfiction, but I also feel like there's space for it to go into the realms of imagination or tip over into fiction quite readily. And I think it's because in my zine making practice, I've been making zines since the mid-1990s, and I still do. I never felt like it had to be any particular genre. I could just write whatever I wanted or felt like I wanted to do. I write a zine called I'm a Camera annually, or roughly annually. And for maybe the last 5 or maybe even more issues, I've used the same kind of technique to write it. And it's one that that is to kind of take these moments from my experience and to build stories around them. And they can go in any direction. They can stay completely faithful to what happened, or sometimes I start writing with them and they go off in unusual directions. And I feel I can follow them because I'm not submitting it to the essay award, or it can be whatever I want. And so for me, zine making is this space of kind of ultimate permission where I can experiment. And I think it has been the thing that's enabled me to be a bit more fluid in terms of genre. I think from the fiction side of things, like that idea that fiction might tip over into autobiography is not an unusual idea, but the idea that in non-fiction that autobiography might tip over into fiction, it's a very destabilizing idea for a lot of people. But it's something I like to play with and kind of push into, I guess.
Maybe with that idea of fluidity, we might return to the fish. And I'll just say to everyone in the audience that so we'll wrap up after Vanessa reads the next half of The Glass Fish, but then she's happy to take questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, write them in the chat and Robert will then ask them on your behalf. Lovely, thanks, Vanessa.
Okay, so we're right in the middle. I'll repeat the middle line. Here, the fish carries my reflection. The room contains 20 years of my life in 4 dozen notebooks stacked up on the shelf guarded by the fish. Whether I'm in it or not, the room is animated. Each day, the light moves across the window, casting the branches outside in shadows on the wall. Before I came to live here, other people observed this same cycle. The room has been the room of a musician. He might have been a magician as well. A musician containing a tower of speakers and equipment. Before that, it was the spare room of the woman who planted the snowdrops which bloom every spring in the garden. She thought of it as the baby's room, although she had no children. The fish retains the impressions of past rooms it has been in. The family's lounge room where it decorated the top of the television, resting on a lace doily. When the mother's eyes strayed from the screen, she saw herself reflected, small and distorted, in its glass belly. She sold it to an antique store, and it was there I had spied it, displayed beside a metal screen shaped like a peacock's tail. The room holds many other rooms inside of it, an infinite regress of rooms tunneling through space and time. The rooms I've entered, slept in, thought of as mine. the rooms that all the objects have been through before ending up here, the rooms described in the books on the shelves. Gregor Samsa hiding behind the closed door of his room, Antoinette Cosway in her attic, dreaming of the house burning. The room will disappear. Its objects will be packed away. The lost things that had slipped down behind the bookcases will be retrieved. The furniture will be carried out. The room will look smaller than it seemed the whole time I knew it. I will look out the window at the oak tree one final time before turning away, leaving the house empty. The excavator will take a first bite, then another, opening up the side wall. Then the house will be gone, its space returned to the open air. The room keeps me safe. I rarely want to leave it. As in a spell, it is a circle drawn around me. The circle is a clock face, which I chase the hands around. It is a wheel which carries my life as it spins. The circle is a lake inside which I float. Reeds brush up against me, obscuring the view so the depth of the waters beneath is difficult to fathom. Within the lake, a seam of cool water comes with a stirring, the movement of a shape I recognize, the fish aswim beside me.
Oh, that's so wonderful, Vanessa. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to hear you read too. Yeah. So we might we might stop recording there, Robert, and then, Robert's there. Yes, Robert might field some questions.